All right, so tonight I'd like to amend some of the things I talked about in my previous video on Plato's Republic, Book 1, mostly in regards to Thrasymachus, which is the main meat and potatoes of this first part of the dialogue. And I don't think I properly characterized Thrasymachus or his arguments. I think it was a mistake because it's such a heavy part of the dialogue. So I wanted to go ahead and do that now. So Thrasymachus is characterized as a wild animal. When he enters the dialogue, he's compared to things like a lion and a wolf and some kind of predatory animal. And this is symbolic of the fact that Thrasymachus, like many sophistic figures, is antisocial by nature. And what I mean by that is that he only cares about himself. Thrasymachus is only worried about gratifying his own desires, which is reflected in his argument, which I'll talk about later. And this is the antithesis of Socrates. Socrates is known for enjoying long dialectical give and take kind of conversations, a kind of conversation that's almost embodies community, right? And Thrasymachus, he likes long speeches. He's a sophist. He teaches rhetoric, the art of making another argument stronger, and making an argument that's weaker seem stronger. All right. So Thrasymachus prefers things like long speeches and essentially conversations with himself uh, over dialogue. And this is why, actually, initially, when he comes in, he makes fun of Socrates. He says, "Oh, your conception of justice is inadequate." And Socrates says, "Well, Thrasymachus, I'd love to hear your argument since you're so wise, you're so knowledgeable on this subject." And Thrasymachus decides to run away at first. He does this by saying, "Oh, well, Socrates, you're going to have to pay me for me to get my arguments cost money. I'm going to put my argument behind a paywall." And of course, Socrates is poor. Socrates he doesn't even have a home. He's completely impoverished, and I'm sure Thrasymachus knows this. But what he probably didn't expect is for the other gentleman to, like Glaucon, to step up and say, "Well, here, I'll pay for Socrates. Make your argument, Thrasymachus." So eventually, Thrasymachus is forced to make his argument, and this argument is fairly simple, and it's essentially just that. Remember, we're talking about justice and what justice is. We're trying to paint a picture of what justice might be through these conversations. So Thrasymachus is saying that justice is the advantage of the stronger. And remember what I said earlier about how he's antisocial by nature, and his main goal, his main drive in life is to satisfy his own desires and not really worry about anybody else. Well, this is perfect for him because, well, Thrasymachus wants to be in a place of power. And if he's in a place of power, it justifies his mistreatment of other people and his lack of care for other people and his antisocial nature. So this argument that he presents is an affirmation of his worldview, but it's not only an affirmation of his worldview, it's him defending the worldview of Athens at the time. All right, so Athens at the time is essentially the most powerful, or one of the most powerful, along with Sparta. They're having a war. Remember, this is in the right after the Peloponnesian War that Athens lost, and Athens and Sparta are going at it. And Athens is one of the strongest figures, so they bully all the city-states around them, and they use this kind of power politics to gratify their desires. They essentially do whatever they want since they're in this position of power. And Plato is commenting on that. Plato disagrees with this kind of thing because he's seen what it leads to. It leads to the destruction of your city. See, Athens lost the war. Why did they lose the war? To Plato, they lost the war because of this kind of power politics and militaristic stance against the other city-states. So Thrasymachus represents this kind of argument, a sort of war of all against all, rather than community or cooperation. And so Thrasymachus defends this argument by saying, well, every city or every empire, what have you, has a certain political regime, and this political regime has a hierarchy. All right, and the people at the top of the hierarchy, or the people above the lower people, decide how the lower people live and what is just. They legislate, they create laws, in other words, and every regime gets to decide differently what justice is. All right. Now, Socrates steps back, like he often does, a very characteristic kind of Socratic move, and he says, well, this doesn't exactly make sense, because the people at the top, although it is true that they might be trying to satisfy their own interests and doing this for their own gain, well, they might not even know what their own interests are. All right? So that's one problem. And Thrasymachus then says, well, these people who legislate in a way that is against their interest, well, that actually, those people aren't true legislators. He pulls up the no true Scotsman fallacy, the idea that, oh, well, anything that disagrees with my conception of what this thing should be, well, I'm going to move the goalpost back, because that's not a true, in this case, legislator or true political leader. All right? And he says that if they were performing well, then they would be these true just people, or these true political leaders. And this is very opposite of what he said before, because remember, before he said, well, justice is relative. We have these different political regimes, and these different political regimes make their own justice. But now he's saying, well, there's this true, he's almost making a Platonic kind of argument. He's saying there's this true form of justice, and if some kind of legislator is not adhering to that, then, well, they're not a true legislator. All right, so he's already almost conceding his own point. But of course, Socrates doesn't cut him off there, right? Which he easily could. Thrasymachus has already destroyed his own argument. All right. So then Socrates says, well, a political leader can be compared to other. He uses the word technician, which essentially just means somebody who reigns over some kind of rule-governed domain. So let me give you an example. Shoemaking. Say you have a cobbler. This cobbler is interested in the techne of making shoes. He's a shoe technician. All right? So a cobbler makes shoes out of the interest of other people. So a cobbler, he's going to make a shoe that fits their foot and it suits their needs, right? He's not doing it just for his own monetary benefit. And Thrasymachus says, well, that seems a little fishy, Socrates, because every technician, maybe they do it and benefit people, but they're really only doing this for their own benefit. For example, some kind of sheep herdsman, or sheep herdsman. They are herding sheep so that they can consume lamb chops, right? And Socrates says, well, that might be an all right argument. The argument of this kind of unjust man trying to get the better of just men and unjust men. Thrasymachus' main argument, like the war of all against all, his conception is, well, if you are just, you are satisfying your own desires, and if you have to screw over everybody, well, that's okay because you're satisfying your own desires. Just keep on doing it, keep on doing it, keep on doing it. Well, Socrates steps back and he says, well, that's not what shoemakers do or doctors do. You don't see a doctor telling another doctor to, get off this patient. The doctor's going to let him do the proper procedures, right? But if a doctor were to see somebody who is ignorant, somebody who is pouring snake oil on the wound, something like that, he's going to push him over and help out the person. So the main idea here is that Thrasymachus is arguing that the unjust man, or his conception of the just man, gets the better of just men and unjust men. He's against everybody. Well, Socrates makes the argument that since a political leader who's interested in helping curate justice within a political regime, well, he's a technician just like the doctor, and he's trying to cure a city just like a doctor is trying to cure a person. So if a political leader walks into a properly run political regime, he's going to say, well, it's all good. I don't need to do anything. Just like the doctor with the patient who's being helped by a doctor already. And so essentially establishing the idea that a technician only wants to get the better of ignorant people. So that essentially refutes Thrasymachus' conception of justice, of the man who tries to get the better of just men and unjust men by providing a better alternative, which is number one, better for the man in question, right? Because if you're only getting the better of the ignorant, you have a lot more people on your side, and cooperation helps you out a lot in society. But also, this kind of argument directly attacks what Thrasymachus is saying and tears it down. All right, because Thrasymachus is saying that this is what justice should be, and Socrates is providing a better alternative. All right, so after this, Thrasymachus, he's done. He's been defeated. You see, Thrasymachus kind of sees this kind of argument, this dialogue, as almost a battle. You know, he's been grown up on Homer, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all these war battles and all of these kind of things. And the closest thing he can get, since he's not in the military, is to have some kind of battle of argumentation. Okay, and of course he gets beaten, and he's very upset because he's trying to impress all these men who are in the room. Remember, we're in Polemachus' house, and they're surrounded by a gang of young men, young Athenian gentlemen, and Thrasymachus is hoping that he can sell them on his rhetorical ability. And Socrates just number one, out-argumented him, but also out-talked him. And finally, Thrasymachus blushes. All right, his face gets all red, he starts to sweat, and this is a sign that Socrates has won the argument. So the whole idea here is that, number one, the power politics of Athens at the time, Plato is saying this is not, he's attacking that. He's saying, well, it might be good for you in the short term to gratify your desires, but in the long term, just like in the long term for Athens, maybe they won a battle here, or won this, won that. In the end, they lost the war. Well, in the end, if you are constantly satisfying your own desires and sliding and being Machiavellian and fucking over anybody in your path, well, you're ultimately going to get the short end of the stick, and you might, who knows, you might die. So it's actually preferable to be the kind of just man that Socrates is arguing for, one who cooperates and only gets the better of the ignorant man. All right, or maybe the man who deserves to be gotten the better of, right? So maybe like a criminal, or think of the idea of self-defense. Thrasymachus is making an argument that you could kill anybody you want, or you could hurt anybody you want. Socrates is saying you could hurt somebody so long as they are trying to hurt you, right? So Socrates' perspective and Plato's perspective, the perspective he's trying to argue for, is not only better for the people around you, but it's also better for yourself in the long run. All right, so that's the argument for justice that's being presented here, the argument that Thrasymachus tries to make, and the argument that Socrates makes in order to destroy Thrasymachus' argument and silence him. Now, the key thing about Socrates' argument here is that it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit airy. There's a lot left to be desired here. Even trying to replicate it in that first video that I made, and even in this video, it's a little bit tough because it almost doesn't seem satisfactory, even when you read it for the first time. And when we move on to book 2, this actually it foreshadows book 2, where we have Glaucon and Adeimantus. They revise Thrasymachus' argument. They provide a stronger argument for the unjust man, and then through Socrates, he ultimately attacks that argument, that stronger argument. And the reason why this stronger argument is presented by Glaucon and Adeimantus rather than Thrasymachus is because Plato wants to paint Thrasymachus, a sophist, in a negative light. He wants to say, well, people who hold these kind of views and hold this kind of position to the world and political life, these people are not good. We need to silence them. And that's what Socrates does. He silences Thrasymachus. And he wants to promote people like Adeimantus and Glaucon, the young men of Athens, natives to Athens, who have potential, who could be good political leaders, and not to mention the fact that they're Plato's brothers, but also the fact that they are able to not only present good arguments and have good rhetoric, but they're able to, number one, devil's advocate for a stance, but also admit that, hey, although I'm arguing for this side, I don't actually agree with it. That's very different from Thrasymachus, where he might take a devil's advocate stance, but he would never even admit to you that this is a devil's advocate stance, because that, at least to him maybe, lessens his convincibility. He only cares about if you're convinced, not if what he's saying is true. And that's the difference between him and Socrates. All he cares about is arguing and creating these kind of arguments and these kind of discussions for his own benefit and for money and for his own status. Socrates is only worried about engaging in these kinds of things for the benefit of others. He actually sometimes, even in this dialogue at the beginning, he didn't want to talk to Polemachus or come to his house, but he feels a moral obligation. He feels a moral obligation to teach people through dialogue and to provide them with a kind of betterment, although he doesn't enjoy it sometimes. He actually really hates it. He'd rather just, be up in wherever, sitting under a tree, philosophizing, right? But yeah, and that's the difference between him and Thrasymachus. So I hope this video painted a better picture of what Thrasymachus' character was, what he represents in this part of the story, the kind of argument he makes, and the kind of counter-argument that Socrates makes. And yeah, I hope you all have a good day, a good night, and yeah, I'll see y'all next time.